What is up, Preacher Creatures? I'm so excited that you're here for another episode of the Preacher Creature podcast. I'm Jake Myers. I teach homiletics at Columbia Theological Seminary.
And I'm Ashley Lewis, a ministry professional in Durham, North Carolina.
So, we have a really exciting episode for you today. We're going to be chatting with my friend, Dr. Donyelle McCray, who's a professor at Yale Divinity School. She's written a fantastic book we'll tell you a little bit about in a second. But this book really opens up the genre of preaching and really is kind of it's like a groundbreaking text in homiletics
Yeah.
because the ways that she's engaging different streams of preaching that typically don't get included in the ways we think about preaching.
Yep.
I think it's going to be a game changer, and I think it's going to open up possibilities for other people to situate themselves as preachers without having to give away some of those aspects of their identity that are so important to them. Danielle and I have been friends for many years, going through the Academy of Homiletics, and she did her PhD at Duke, I did my PhD at Emory, so we've kind of grown up together in homiletics, and I don't think there's a book that I've been more excited to have access to because she like most scholars, she uses essays and conference presentations to kind of tease out some of the ideas that she uses in the book.
Yeah.
So there were three essays that I've reread multiple times that she's written. One was it's called On Shrieking Truth, and it was looking at Mary and the phenomenon of proclamatory wailing as a sermon genre. She also has one called Playing in Church, and this subtitle is Insights from the Boundaries of the Sermon Genre. And then she has this incredible essay in Practical Matters, which is run out of Emory University's graduate school. It's called Sweating, Spitting, and Cursing, Intimations of the Sacred, where she looks at other ways that we are proclaiming that don't fall into the, noun, verb, adjective kind of category. So this book is going to be fantastic, and I was so excited to read it.
It's so really incredible the way that she's formed this book to tackle different genres that we really should think more of as preaching, making the connections between song and quilting and dance and novels and meditations. It's so rich, and I think many different people can find their way into this text, whether they think of themselves as preachers or not, or just people who enjoy a sort of proclamatory posture in ministry, in lay ministry. It's been exciting for me, especially because I think, especially over this last couple of years, I've been on this journey to try to reconnect with myself as an artist. This is such an interesting phenomenon for me because I grew up dancing really intensively. I studied dance like in boarding school, art school. And then, even after I had to stop dancing for kind of health reasons, I was still also always a singer. So singing has continued to be, and I've mentioned this before on the podcast, singing is a way that I still practice an art form. And I, yet I think like my time in more formal institutions, my time in the corporate world, just certain pressures that get put on us as
Mm-hmm.
we develop and go through these different, really highly structured environments, and start to adhere to different kinds of values in those spaces. I really lost touch with myself as an artist, and what role creativity has in my well being, in my spiritual life, in my relationships, and how I understand myself. And I think that while I interacted with that aspect of myself a bit in seminary, it wasn't until after I finished seminary that I realized, oh, I actually need to redevelop, regrow, and reconnect with my kind of inner artist. And the Artist Way book was a really huge
Yeah.
part of helping me do that. And then it was like a natural connection to start thinking of, well, right now it feels like as much as I I do still sing, and writing is an important part of my life and ministry. Preaching is my primary art form right now. It is
Mm.
the vocation and the task that I primarily think of as my artistic outlet. And when I want to stretch those creative muscles, I notice the connections and the kind of flow that opens up into better preaching. And that isn't only the drafting and writing process, it's very much the embodied nature of preaching as well, and
Yeah.
how I see that identity as interacting with the world, with my community, with creation, with God. So all that to say, this book has really been a gift in so many ways already, and I think. Like some of our other books, this is just the start of how revolutionary this book is going to be for me. But I think it holds so much promise and potential for many of our listeners that are now going to have this incredibly strong and authoritative voice, and yet gentle and encouraging voice from Dr. McCray, to embrace those aspects of our histories, our the legacies, ancestors that we come after, who have gone about ministry, whether it's recognized formally in their communities or not, and to see the way that all of those things can inform us now, to be better preachers in many different ways that doesn't only look like pulpit preaching.
Yeah. Yeah. I think you named that so clearly, Ashley. And I know a lot of students come into seminary, and some have already been kind of painted into a box about like this counts as a sermon, and if I don't do this just this way, then it's something else.
Right.
Um, or we came in with all this like artistic energy that is kind of like stamped out of us because it's
Yeah.
like, no, 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 this is what preaching is. Like
Yeah.
that doesn't count as preaching. But when you have a voice like Dr. McCray kind of whispering in our ears saying, no, no, it kind of is preaching.
Yeah.
Like go ahead
Yeah.
and go there. It starts to like deconstruct the authority structures that, with the people who get to decide what counts as a sermon and what doesn't. And it allows us to be more playful in the pulpit,
Mm.
which I think is always going to help invigorate our preaching ministries.
Yes. And I wonder about the connections that our listeners might be able to make between how a book like this can inform their community. Um,
Mm.
Again, if we're trying to uh, enhance and encourage different types of ministry leadership, lay ministry leadership in our churches, then reading a book like this together as a community could bring forth some of these gifts from the congregation that would really encourage people to think of the different ways that they participate in their church community as also having the power of preaching.
Yeah.
And it's exciting, I think, for some preachers maybe to think about ways that they can expand their own preaching identity, but the possibilities for this book are even beyond that. If a preacher isn't necessarily seeing a way to use dance as sermon right away, but they do have folks in their congregation who might want to explore something like that. Then you're finding a conversation where many people in the community become invested in what preaching is in a different way. So it's
Yeah.
really, it's got so much exciting possibility.
Yeah. Yeah. And I don't want to presume that all of our listeners know who Dr. McCray is, so
Mm-hmm.
just want to give you kind of a brief bio. So, Dr. Donyelle McCray serves as an associate professor of homiletics at Yale Divinity School. She's a teacher, a writer, and an Episcopal layperson. Her scholarship focuses mostly on the ways that African American women and lay people can use the sermon to play, to remember, to invent, and to disrupt. She is the author of The Censored Pulpit, Julian of Norwich as a Preacher. And, she's got other books in the pipeline, has written many, many articles. And, she's already kind of bringing together this diversity. Like she got a doctor of jurisprudence from Harvard Law School.
Mm.
So she
Yes.
brought that into her work when she did a PhD at Duke under Dr. Chuck Campbell, who was one of my major influences in deciding to become a homiletician. So yeah, she is absolutely the perfect person to help us think more expansively about this genre of preaching.
The name of the book Is It a Sermon? Art, Activism, and Genre Fluidity in African American Preaching. So let's go ahead and dive into this conversation with Dr. McCray. We are honored to have her chat with us and can't wait for you all to hear this wonderful conversation.
Yeah, let's do it. Donyelle, thank you so much for joining us today. We are so excited that you're joining us on the Preacher Creature podcast. Thanks for being here.
I'm so happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, this is a book that that I've been anticipating for several years. I'm so excited that it's out, and I'm so glad that we're getting to talk to you about it a little bit. One of the ways we typically like to start these is for you to tell us a little bit about like what was your motivation for writing the book, and how do you think it will offer kind of a more expansive vision of the sermonic genre and our notions of sermonic authority?
Mm. Well, I'll say, I've always been fascinated by the different approaches to preaching and by the different motivations that propel those different approaches. If we could think in terms of archetypes, the herald, the storyteller, the
Mm-hmm.
exhorter, I think of them almost like different colored crayons in a huge box of
Oh,
possibilities, right?
that's really good.
And
Yeah.
and I'm fascinated also by lay preaching
Mm-hmm.
and by taking it seriously in a way that doesn't necessarily require simply mimicking what happens in a pulpit.
Yeah.
On a deeper level, I'll say that I'm really interested in that dimension of African American preaching that we might call wisdom sharing,
Mm.
that conveying of ancestral wisdom.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that dimension of preaching requires opening up these conceptions of genre
Yeah.
and and seeing preaching as flowing in the same stream as dance, song,
Mm.
storytelling, communal prayer. So, so this exploration of genre really allowed me to enter those dynamics. I really do think of the book as a meditation on ancestral wisdom
Mm-hmm.
on
Mm.
some level, even as I explore these different kinds of these different forms of genre. And I think for so many, um, the call to preach is really an elastic call. And there's an expectation in the African American communities that I'm most familiar with that when one is preaching, one is also a steward of the traditions.
Yeah.
And being that steward means having some interplay with these different forms of genre.
Mm.
Awesome.
Yes. So to start by, for us, our listeners, exploring some of those genres here together, we'll start with the chapter that you open with, which gives attention to the more sonorous qualities of preaching
Mm,
and what preachers might learn from performers like Mahalia Jackson, who
mm,
chapter one examines closely. And that chapter looks at her life, her legacy as this hugely influential gospel singer of the 20th century.
mhm,
Her musical offerings really help us see the connection between song and sermon in
mhm.
African American preaching. You write, I'm going to give us a little quote from you.
Okay.
You write that preaching is, at its plainest, a kind of song in that
Mm,
it is a heartfelt utterance that aims to glorify God. In this respect, even the preacher's unsyncopated speech holds cosmic power.
Mm.
mm.
Singing provides a fitting paradigm for preaching because it indicates a homiletical posture for truth telling. Mm, that is so good. Could you say more about this for our listeners, and especially how sages like Mahalia Jackson foster a more dialogical posture for
Mm,
truth?
mm. Well, when I think about Mahalia's story, what strikes me is that she had a very integrated way of proclaiming. And I think of singing as a very integrated way of bearing truth and communicating that truth to another in a way that weaves mind, heart, will, body, and even as it seeks to reach to a very deep place in the heart and mind of the listener, um, respects the integrity of that listener. The listener maintains their subjectivity,
Yeah.
is what I'm trying to say. And there's a certain way that the integration also allows us to draw on the fullness of the tradition, on the repertoire of
Yeah.
stories and scripture and maxims, right, that have been used to uphold the lives of our communities. So there's something about the posture of singing, of sharing something that comes from a very deep place within. Um, and it's very much an offering. It's not a mandate.
Right.
It's not a command, but it is an invitation. And I think that posture, particularly in this historical moment where there's so much um, rhetorical jousting, if you will,
Yeah.
that the
Yeah.
idea of offering this, of making an offering,
Mhm.
um, is just seems really compelling to me right now. And I also, just on a practical level, the relationship between preaching and song is a pretty well traveled. It's pretty well traveled territory.
Yeah.
And I thought it would make a good starting place for thinking about the
Mm.
shoreline more broadly, because
Yeah.
it's, we can see this, right? And so then it's easier for me to talk about quilting or
Yes.
something else after
Yeah.
we've acknowledged that there's a clear shoreline between preaching and song. So,
Mhm.
yeah.
Yeah, that's how I felt when I read chapter one. I was like, "Oh, this is great," because the work of William Turner Jr. and
Yes.
Evans Crawford and Kirk Byron Jones.
Yes.
There's like this strong homiletical resonance between what the sermon is doing and what songs are doing.
Hmm.
And then I read chapter two, and I was like, "The quilter." Like, this is such a novel paradigm for
Yes.
expanding our conceptualization of what qualifies as a sermon.
Mm,
And I love how you lift up these two figures that I was unfamiliar with,
mm,
Rosie Lee Tompkins and Harriet
mhm,
Powers,
mm,
as kind of modeling an effective and a non-argumentative approach to Black preaching.
mhm,
And you rightly named that a quilt can be a sermon that subverts the way that language has been a tool of racialized oppression and dehumanization.
mhm,
Wow, I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about the categories of affective energy and
mm,
didactic intent
mhm,
that play with texture, much like sermons play with words and gestures.
mhm,
And also, like, how can these categories challenge traditional norms of authority and embodiment?
mm. There's so many layers to your question. I guess that I'd begin by saying that quilting is a highly affective medium.
Mhm.
Yeah.
It's a form of memory speech. And because of the ways that quilting is, on a very literal level, it has a softness, it has a tenderness. Um, it connects us to the body of the quilter. Often quilts have, pricks of blood in them. We know that the person who handled them has been very close to it. And so there's a certain way that quilts connect us with the bodies of our mothers, grandmothers, aunts, uncles who created them. And so that level of softness flows to the works of Harriet Powers and Rosie Lee Tompkins. There's a story that always speaks to me about Rosie Lee Tompkins' 1985 quilt string. And when it was displayed, there was a woman who stood before it and wept because of the ways the fabrics of velour and the deep colors really spoke to her, and just caught her on this visceral level. So that's what I think about in terms of affective energy. It's this impartation of softness and um, connection that's communicated through the different fabrics. Um, and I'll also say on that the juxtaposition of fabrics is also offers this opportunity to think about reordering.
Okay.
The arrangement and rearrangement of chaos
Yeah.
or discord. And it reminds me a lot of Chuck Campbell's work in his most recent book, when he talks about patterns and false patterns and interrupting them. And I think that
Yeah.
quilting has a way of helping us look at the development and disruption of patterns, and the making of wholes, amid fragmentation. So,
Mm.
um, and then in terms of didactic intent, Harriet Powers is clearly making an argument on some level, right?
Sure.
She's um, talking to us about the divine hand, in one quilt, this very strong motif, and inviting this reflection on the judgment and presence of God. So there is this clear sense of progression and thoughtful gazing,
Mm-hmm.
that invites us to think about our spirituality. I will say that I received a quilt in July from a dear friend,
Oh,
um, I'd say that there was an embroidered piece of this blanket that I will call quilting, that included a reference to scripture, "My grace is sufficient for thee."
Mm.
mm,
And I found myself tracing that, with my finger on the blanket. And it did impart a different way of knowing that verse, right?
mm-hmm.
To feel it.
Yeah.
And so these different ways of knowing,
Yeah.
that quilting invites us into, I think are very valuable. Tactile knowledge is really on the edges of our consciousness. I know the feel of my desk. I know the
Yeah.
feel of this blanket that I lean on in my chair
Mhm.
all the time. And so that impartation of comfort, or coldness is
Yeah.
very real in our lives, even though it's at the edge of
Yeah.
consciousness. And I see Harriet Powers and Rosie Lee Tompkins inviting us to enter that to enter that space.
Mm.
Yeah. When I read it, I thought of this sermon that Fred Craddock once preached.
Mm.
I think it's titled "When the Roll is Called Down Here."
Oh yeah, I know
Do you
this.
know this
Yeah,
sermon?
I do. Yeah,
Yeah, it's a classic. And
it
and one of the elements, one of the moves of the sermon is he's talking about this quilt that the people made at his first church when he
is.
left.
Mm,
And so every time they move, they like get the quilt out and they like remember the names of the people who are
mm,
kind of represented. And it can
mm,
be kind of a like a tactile like way of remembering and
yeah.
holding on to these
Mm.
connections that maybe we're separated by distance, but in the
Mhm.
eschatological sense, like we're all connected to one another. So it's
Mm.
yeah, it's fun.
Yeah,
And in an
yeah.
ecological sense, it keeps making me think about the repurposing,
Yes.
Yeah.
and
Mm.
reweaving things into a new whole, similar
Right.
to what you were mentioning, but particularly the repurposing aspects. Um,
Mm.
and there's so much theological depth to explore there too, about how we
Yes.
understand our connections to each other, our connections to creation, to God, and what activities we're invited into.
Yes. I think
Um,
absolutely. Yeah.
it's so fun to think about these mediums and preaching together. I was especially drawn to the next chapter, which is entitled "The Dancer," for
Mm,
many reasons. Really, it's personal for me because I was a dancer for much of my
mm,
life. In fact, it
mm,
was my first vocation, really. But
mm,
I meant to pursue it professionally, but because of a spine condition, I couldn't do that.
mm,
Um, so connecting with this story from about Sister Thea Bowman is so powerful,
mm,
not only because of her story and legacy, but also your homiletical framing. It just makes me realize how much dance is still with me personally,
mm,
even in my preaching in other areas of life, but how much possibility there is for us in preaching and dance as proclamation. So, yeah, Sister Bowman was such a trailblazer. And there was also such intentionality and thoughtfulness in her ministry. She was pushing back on anti Black racism, on
mhm,
colonialism, on patriarchy, and even human centrism.
mm.
And
Very
she
much.
did,
Yeah.
yeah, she did so much to challenge these traditional notions of communication and wisdom and catechesis across the Christian tradition. So we're we're really grateful to have this story. I wonder if you can share with us some more insight about how proclamatory dance can awaken this kinesthetic realm
Yeah.
that involves both thinking and moving. And how do
Hmm.
you hope that contemporary preachers might learn from this mode of sermonic expression?
Hmm. Can you? I'm just so curious. Can you quickly tell me what forms of dance you engaged in?
Yes,
Yeah. Yeah.
yes. I grew up in a kind of typical studio that did some competition, and I did all range of dance. And one of the things that I loved about being in a competition centric studio as a kid was that performance was
Mm.
always on the horizon. It
Yeah.
wasn't like we practiced and trained all year for one recital at the end. We
Hmm.
went through a rigorous season of performing every single weekend, multiple things on stage, multiple
Wow.
days. Um, and then I got serious. So that was in tap, ballet, modern, jazz, musical theater. And then I got serious about ballet as I got a little bit older. And I
Hmm.
actually went to the North Carolina School of the Arts in Winston-Salem.
Mm.
And yeah, and studied there for high school, did a lot of summer
Mm.
programs, intensives,
Mm.
and started college for dance, but then my back issues caught up with me. So
Mm. Okay.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Wow. Thank you
Thanks for
for
asking.
sharing that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, Well, I mean, it just strikes me as you were sharing that you could see how how strong the sort of dance community can be. Yeah. So I will say that just this Wednesday, I heard a fantastic sermon in class
Mhm.
by a student who was talking about what it means to have Jesus in the boat with you. And
Mhm.
this, it was about, Jesus calming the storm. And throughout that sermon, there's a certain way that she was dancing, she was moving back and forth, not
Yeah.
in a distracted way, but in a rhythmic way of
Mm.
helping us to see this. And what struck me was that the dance, though subtle, was not just illumining the words.
Mm.
The words were in many ways illumining the dance
Yes.
because the message was
Mm.
incarnated in her movement.
Yeah.
Mm.
um, and so that's what I see as sort of thinking in the moving,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
Finding that place in the body where the truth comes alive and is expressed
Mm.
to the listener, and accepting that we are in many ways saturated with language, but we have these. There's a level of our consciousness that is pre-verbal, and
Yeah.
we respond to gesture and
Yeah.
movement. And there are places that language does not go or doesn't go easily. And gesture can often go to those places. So, I think of kinesthetic perception as a realm of perception that addresses the kind of estrangement, bodily estrangement that so many of us experience,
Mhm.
and reckons with the fact that truth is has an embodied dimension, that
Mhm.
it's not a purely abstract concept.
Right.
And certainly the wisdom that Sister Thea was communicating was an embodied wisdom.
Mm.
So that was very important. And well, I was digging through the Alice Walker's papers.
Oh wow.
It's an incredible collection. And I came across a place where she was reflecting on seeing Alvin Ailey's Revelations for the
Mm.
first time, and described it as, I'm maybe paraphrasing here, as a kind of dance poem.
Mm.
Could
Yes.
see, all of the meaning that's flowing through it. And um, that depiction just made me think a lot about preaching, right? About how movement can um, convey meaning. And I also think that dance invites us to think in terms of symbols, in
Yes.
terms of
Hmm.
metaphor, image. And these are really essential components of the homiletical mind, is to think
Absolutely.
in terms of metaphor and and symbol as well. So
It's really, it
yeah.
feeds me so much to just to read this, to hear and have this conversation, because
Oh.
there is a way that dance has been living in my preaching all along.
Mm,
Um,
mm-hmm.
and I really only get glimpses, have had glimpses of it here and there, but to have it articulated, thanks to your work, is just so so illuminating and healing, I
Um,
think.
oh, I was so happy to hear that.
Yeah, and Ashley knows what she's talking about. She won the top preacher award when she
Oh,
was a student here at Columbia Seminary.
Wow.
So
Wow,
I
that's
try not to
amazing.
dance around in the pulpit too much, but I'm going to embrace it in a new way after this.
yeah, I imagine for a lot of folks, this book, like having these different archetypes as you hopefully name them, it's gonna help them tap into a wisdom that maybe they had bracketed
Hmm.
from their preaching.
Absolutely.
I'm not much of a dancer,
Mm,
but as I was reading, I was like, "Oh, Ashley's gonna love this chapter."
mm.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh.
But somebody I did know a lot about was Howard
Hmm.
Thurman, I'm so excited that you
Mm,
you lifted him up. There's some really exciting work going around about him and his work. I'm thinking
mm.
of the work that Trey Clark is doing out at Fuller
Yes.
on Howard Thurman's
Yes.
preaching. And even as he's probably the most readily identifiable
Hmm.
preacher that you look at in the traditional sense of what a preacher is, you lift up the way that he expands our understanding of what counts as a sermon.
Hmm.
And you rightly recognize Thurman's meditations as a mode of both intercession that meld the discursive boundaries and of petitionary prayer with
Hmm.
that of a sermon. And these meditations you observe are not so much arguments, but invitations to ruminate.
Hmm.
That was a direct quote from your book. I thought that was really powerful.
Hmm.
And I believe our listeners would love to hear you tease out the ways that Thurman's work expands the generic conventions demarcating the sermon,
Hmm.
and also how his ways of working with time and silence could
Hmm.
facilitate such an expansion.
Yeah. Um, well, I'll just have to say that Howard Thurman is just so deep in my soul, as an exemplar and as a spiritual teacher. So it was really fun to explore his work. Well, I'll say that one of the key insights that he offers um, is that he encourages preachers not to rush to resolution.
Mm,
And I think there's a certainly we're formed, I'd say, contemporary preaching and is certainly informed by the kind of problem solution form of preaching, um, but also this contemporary moment I see pushes us to resolve, to answer, to um, come to some resolution. And there are costs to that. And one of the costs is a shallowness.
Yeah.
One of the costs is a sermon that does not reckon with the complexity of our lives.
Mm.
yeah.
And so he encourages depth, and he does that through silence, which he understands to have a great denseness, a density to it,
Yeah.
and is not afraid of a long,
Mm.
awkward, I would say awkward pause in his meditations. And that also is true in his sermons. Sometimes
Yeah.
they're very lengthy pauses. And when I think about Evans Crawford's work, he talks about the different tones of silence,
Yeah.
and the different ways that silence can communicate. Now, that's very evident in Howard Thurman's preaching and in his meditations. But he also gets into the inner dialogue of the listener in a way that doesn't ever feel intrusive to me,
Hmm.
but again is about conveying a sense of dignity to human life and taking seriously the mysteries and absurdities and dilemmas that we live with.
Yeah.
So, I think if preaching has any value, it helps us enter the dilemmas of our lives,
Hmm.
and takes those seriously and helps us stare at these incongruities.
Yes.
Um, and we need that. We need that today. Um, I guess I'd also say that there's a certain way in which um, Thurman's meditations take us to this line between the visible and the invisible.
Mm.
Helps us
Mm-hmm.
helps us.
Mm.
They kind of perch us
Yeah.
on the line, and the empirical world doesn't have the kind of grip that it had before. Um, if we move through his meditations,
Mm.
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. It's almost like those spaces are challenging the status quo.
yeah,
Uh, and that silence that's able to cut through our
hmm,
perceptions that this is the way the world has to be.
Mm-hmm.
But it's like it opens a portal to the prophetic imagination and to
mm,
imagine this world otherwise, which is
yeah,
Yeah.
you capture so beautifully in your chapter on him.
mm,
Yeah.
thank you.
More prophetic imagination comes in the chapter on Toni Morrison.
Mm,
And this is looking at her sermons,
hmm,
the sermons that she writes into her novels,
hmm,
and the kind of sermonic qualities of the novels as a whole. So the parabolic nature of Morrison's novels is, as you
hmm,
say, this slow path to truth.
yeah,
And I do think it reminds us, of course, a lot about it reminds us of Jesus's way of teaching with parables. And your
hmm,
chapter offers some really valuable insight about narrative preaching that goes beyond the new homiletic. So
mm,
it seems like this chapter, if it's calling us, I think it is calling us to some things. It's I found it to be not so much calling us to necessarily just get comfortable with preaching the parables, as in sermons about scriptures that contain parables where we address them well, but
mm,
I hear an invitation to craft sermons as parables.
hmm.
Do you think that's right? And if so, what power does that hold for preaching, especially given the challenges of our time, which you've already alluded to?
Mm. I think that's a really wonderful interpretation of what I'm aiming to do.
Mm,
So thank you. Well, what I see Toni Morrison doing, and actually, she actually says this explicitly about her aims in novels. She wants to nourish. She
yeah.
wants to clarify what has worked and what hasn't. She wants to examine um, African American culture. And she wants to sharpen moral imagination. She's very clear about
Mhm.
those aims, and in order to do that, she wants to wrestle with really important questions,
Mm-hmm.
and she does not want to. I mean, just sort of go back to what I was saying about Thurman. Rush to a tidy answer,
Right.
because that doesn't reflect actual the human condition and
Yeah.
our lives.
Yeah.
And so, I do feel like she's answering these questions about how do we move forward, or when we don't feel like we have a reason for living, or how do we
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
find a new reason, or um, how do we forgive, and what does it mean? Like, these questions are um, real for her, and um, I think the willingness to dive into those deep places is a good model for contemporary preaching.
Mm-hmm.
She also uses a lot of indirectness, which I talk
Yeah.
about.
Mhm.
And I'd say that that's one place where I wonder about the cultural moment that we're in, where everything is so in your face, and
Right.
capacities for subtlety may be diminishing. So, you know, um, the indirectness is, I think, a challenge, but really important strategy for
Yeah.
helping people engage the parable that is life. So,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah. There's a lot of directness and a lot of avoidance, but not so
Mhm.
much a lot of the indirect engagement that
Right.
you're talking about. That's really profound.
Mhm.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about that mode of preaching in my work on stand-up comedy and homiletics,
Yeah,
and
yeah, yeah.
And Fred Craddock, that was his kind of big thing, is that
Mm-hmm.
from drawing from Kierkegaard, is
Mm-hmm.
sometimes if you overhear people talking, it invites you in to receive what they're saying in a much deeper way than if they're speaking it directly to you. And
Yes.
I think,
Absolutely. Yeah.
that your engagement with Morrison's work was just a wonderful expansion on that idea, which I'd
Mm-hmm.
never thought about. So
Mm-hmm.
thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah. So another question that we have is, throughout the book, you display a certain kind of ambivalence about
Mm-hmm.
preaching.
Mm-hmm.
So, on the one hand, you recognize that preaching has been a tool of oppression that
Mm-hmm.
substantiates the evil ideology of white supremacy.
Mm-hmm.
But on the other hand, you celebrate the ways that sermons can foster encounters with the ancestors.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to quote you here, rooting the listener's spiritual story in a longer communal history of faith
Mm-hmm.
and reminding the people of the larger spiritual family of which they are a part. I love the way you phrase that.
Mm-hmm.
So, my question is, now that you've finished this groundbreaking work, has your view of preaching changed? And if so, in what ways?
Um, so I'll say that I still love a good old fashioned 20-minute, 30-minute oration from the pulpit.
Mm.
Um, but I think that I am more sensitive to the ways that um, the ancestors are speaking. And um, that there's a role for fidelity to those who've gone before. I'm thinking specifically African American ancestors,
Mm.
those who've died in the Middle Passage, those we know by name, those we don't, those who were great exemplars of the past. Um, there's a role for fidelity to them and to taking seriously the role we have for shaping reality during our time on Earth and in um, caring for those who will come after us. And that
Yeah.
means, to go back to what Sister Thea was talking about, it means being very attentive to the earth.
Yeah.
And similarly, Harriet Powers, I mean, the love of stars and
Yeah.
animal life, that's
Yes.
vivid. So I think there's a role for caring for the earth and thinking about those who will follow us. And I think that I have a higher view for um, really searching for those perspectives, postures, angles on reality that ancestors offer.
Mm.
It's just a really important stream in African American preaching, something that Henry Mitchell talks about in terms of the importance of the reference to the grandparent that often comes in the sermon. What is
Yeah.
being carried in that? Um, but I don't know. I just think it's deepened my awareness and sensitivity to past.
Mm.
Yeah. So.
Yeah, that's great.
Mm, mm,
And I know you have another book in the works. I don't know if you
mm.
want to give us a little teaser about your work on Polly Murray
Oh,
and
sure.
her work in witness.
Yes. So I'm writing a book called The Apostle Polly
Oh.
and the
Oh, that's
Spirituality of
great.
Risk Taking. That the book explores Polly's spirituality and preaching.
Mm.
And I think challenges, I'd say, popular frame for Polly Murray that sort of treats Polly as a kind of civil rights figure whose priesthood is kind of a cherry on top of that.
Mm.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
I really trace the roots of Polly's spirituality from childhood to adulthood, how it's evolved, and the different ways that Polly preaches through and is very conscious of poems as first iterations of sermons,
Mm-hmm.
seeing the overlap between the two. But I'm thinking about Polly's poems, letters, which were written in line with the Apostle Paul's model, um, memoir, and sermon. So I'm thinking about Polly Murray's life and witness and Paul is a kind of inner companion to me. So I'm excited about that book. And then the other project that I'm working on with WJK is called The Introverted Preacher.
Oh,
I've noticed
wow.
that there's so many introverts among preachers. Yeah, me too. And I guess for the past year and a half now, or 2 years, I've been teaching a course called Preaching for Introverts
Wow.
at the Divinity School. And the
Wow.
work that's come out of it has been just wonderful. So that's the other project I'm working on.
That's
So.
incredible.
Yeah.
I will say I recently learned the term ambivert.
Ambiverts, yes.
And I think even especially I wonder how many of us had a realization during or a major change in the during the pandemic,
Sure.
lockdown era that like I can really never go back to being the kind of fully extroverted person I was before. And I'm just tired thinking about how that was. And so now I'm embracing the ambivert idea that like I'm really gonna have times of both,
Yes.
and want to learn all I can from my introverted peers. So that class sounds so exciting, and we just thank you so much for your ongoing work.
Yeah.
This this book, Is It a Sermon, is so expansive in its potential. I think, especially as you mentioned in the beginning, just that aspect of honoring lay preacher and ministry that looks different from traditional preaching, and inviting us to really honor alongside you, especially those of us who are really reckoning with and wrestling constantly with a white identity and how to honor those who our ancestors didn't necessarily honor in their lives, but how can we do that now? And you invite us into that in such a beautiful way, even as not the primary audience for your book, but what I'm so grateful for the many, many ways that this book is speaking to us, and excited for your ongoing work.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. We thank you for being with us today. And we want to just give a reminder to our Preacher Creature audience. Is It a Sermon is available. Go find it at your bookseller, and enjoy this work alongside us as we celebrate Dr. McCray. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's great to see you.
Great to see you too. Great to meet you, Ashley.
You too. You too.